Hey everybody, this is Professor Stuart Warden. I'm a professor of physical therapy at Indiana University, but I have my roots in Australia where I got my physiotherapy degree and my PhD at the University of Melbourne. We're talking today about some of our recent papers on preventing bone stress injuries or stress fractures in runners. And you're listening to the physical performance show here with Brad Beer.
Failure is not an option.
I've had my ups and my downs.
I think it's an absolutely breakthrough experience.
Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, the show designed to inspire the pursuit of your physical best performance. I'm your host, Brad Beer. Listen in as we delve into how the world's top physical performers achieve their success, as well as the highs, the lows, and the journey of getting there. Let's get ready, set, let's go. Welcome to episode 281 of the Physical Performance Show, brought to you by Precision Hydration's brand new fuel range, the Physical Performance Show's Learnings membership, and our upcoming live stream event featuring UK-based sports dietitian and author Rinny McGregor. I'm Brad Beer, sports physiotherapist and exercise scientist by trade and training, and founder of Pogo Physio. Each week, we'll bring you the latest and greatest information and inspiration designed to help you perform at your physical best. Of course, we do this across a range of our different episodes, expert editions, interest editions, coaches' corners, featured performers, and catch-up episodes. And on this week's episode, we were due to release our catch-up episode. However, with the excitement of the Tokyo Olympics happening at the time of recording, we aren't outputting our catch-up episode this week. Instead, we are bringing to you an expert edition around preventing bone stress injuries in runners. And this is a conversation that is crucial for any endurance athlete. As you often hear on the show, endurance athletes struggle with bone, tendon, and joint-related concerns, and there is unlikely an endurance athlete across their lifespan that will not deal with a bone stress injury at some point. Now, today's guest, Professor Stuart Warden, recently alongside colleagues Brent Edwards and Dr Rich Willey, former featured guest of the show, released a landmark commentary by way of a scientific paper titled Preventing Bone Stress Injuries in Runners with Optimal Workload. It was published in February 2021, and it's must reading for any coach, athlete or practitioner working in the field of endurance sports. And in today's conversation, we dive deep into the contents. The paper explores what it is that the authors mean by bone workload, optimal workload to induce skeletal adaptation, the fact that not all athletes have good skeletons, why it is that distance running does not build good bones, how we can use periodization to help build more bone, the effects of early specialization with sport and the contribution to bone stress injury risk, why it is that optimizing bone structure is critical and how it only develops before puberty, how it is that we can positively affect our bone density and bone architecture through loading with multiple direction jumps, and why it is only during puberty that this is possible, how we can positively increase the robustness of our skeleton through bone-centric exercises, and how we can try and minimize training errors to avoid the onset of a bone stress injury, a stress fracture, a stress reaction, or the like. There's some key takeaways here that will forever shape the way you think about your return to run programming or your running program in general. Such examples include the role that speed or the speed at which we run plays on loading the skeleton, and how associated with that is an exponential risk of bone stress injury onset compared with the risk that's more linear for increasing minutes or volume. So there's a lot of learnings in this expert edition with Professor Stu Warden. You will want to listen back several times, I suspect, and have your pen and paper or device at the ready. By way of bio, Stu, first and foremost, is an avid runner, and academically and professionally, Dr Stuart Warden serves as a professor of physical therapy and the Associate Dean for Research within the Indiana University School of Health and Human Sciences. Professor Stu embarked on Post Doctorates at the Australian Institute of Sport and Indiana University Department of Orthopaedic Surgery, following graduation from the University of Melbourne with a Physiotherapy Degree in 2001. Professor Warden's research interests focus on the form and function of the musculoskeletal system, in particular the lifelong contribution of physical activity to skeletal health. Professor Stu has contributed to over 170 peer-reviewed publications and currently serves as an associate editor for the Journal of Orthopaedic and Sports Physical Therapy Journal, and also as an editorial board member for Bone, Journal of Bone and Mineral Research, and the Journal of Science and Medicine in Sport. Quite simply, Professor Stu Warden is prolific, and as a practitioner, Stuart's work has largely shaped my own practice and approach when it comes to rehabilitation of and preventing bone stress injuries in runners. So here is my conversation with Professor Stuart Warden, preventing bone stress injuries in runners, on this expert edition. Professor Stuart Warden, welcome to the Physical Performance Show.
Brad, thanks for having me. I've been listening to this show for ages and, it's great to be on it.
Oh, wow. Well, Stu, you've just made my morning here Australia time. It's evening time there in Indiana, US. I must say your work has so richly shaped my clinical practice. So it's a huge thank you to you and your team there at Indiana University and beyond for all the great publications you've been outputting. In particular, one grabbed my attention recently, and I think lots of physios around the world and practitioners who work in this space of working with runners, and that was the publication Preventing Bone Stress Injuries in Runners with Optimal Workload, where you teamed up with Brent Edwards and obviously Dr. Rich Willey. So that's made quite the impression on many practitioners.
That was a fun paper to write, and I've got to give props to Brent Edwards, who's more of a biomechanist, so probably not so well known in the rehab world, but especially Rich Willey as well. Most people, I think you've had on the show maybe before. Definitely most people know him. But, this body of work, it sort of came out, we've been asked over the last few years to sort of present on bone stress injuries. And so this was basically a compilation of what we've been presenting, and it was time to put it together into something and just disseminate it to as many people as possible, as opposed to those just going to the talks that we were presenting.
And you've done that, and it will live for perpetuity now and help so many people. And this show is all about translating science into practical takeaways for practitioners, coaches, athletes. So if we explore that translation from this paper around preventing bone stress injuries in runners with optimal workload, perhaps we start with bone stress injuries, Stu, and just a very brief overview of their pathophysiology, how they happen and how common they are.
Yeah, and this term sort of bone stress injury, a lot of people may not actually sort of be familiar with, but it's basically encapsulates a different range of sort of stress injuries to bone, which includes stress fractures. And so most listeners will know, when you say stress fracture, they know exactly what you're talking about. It's a bone overuse injury, but the bone stress injury includes stress fractures, which have an actual defect on X-ray, and also stress reactions, that changes on MRI that don't necessarily have a cortical or a bony defect on X-ray. So this term bone stress injury includes sort of any overuse injury to bone, but it sort of gets interchanged with stress fracture, which is one of the components of a bone stress injury. But what we think about in terms of the pathophysiology is that bone naturally or normally has little areas of micro damage in it, little cracks. And like I said, that's normal. Everyone, sort of listening has about 1 million sites in their body where there's a million little cracks in their bone. And those little cracks are stimulus for the bone to resorb that old piece of bone and replace it with new bone. And that's sort of what distinguishes humans from, say, bridges and other engineering sort of materials, is that even though our bones are designed to resist mechanical loading and force, they can renew themselves and they can regenerate and replace old bone with new bone. So this is a normal phenomenon. And what we think happens with a bone stress injury or stress fracture is that those areas of micro damage or micro cracks, either you get too many of them, or they start joining together and they form bigger cracks and they develop into something that causes pain and weakens the bone and makes it susceptible to a fracture. So we think it's this accumulation of these micro cracks due to excessive loading that then developed into this sort of pathology that we see clinically.
So accumulation of micro damage or micro cracks there, Stu, that progress to pain and pathology in someone's bones. The paper outlines, Stu, a couple of really interesting things. One is the role of porosity. So the bone stress injuries cause porosity and therefore reduced, the paper cites, mechanical properties at that region of the bone. Can you just share a little bit about the role of porosity and how that matters?
Yeah, so these micro cracks, when you develop a micro damage or micro crack in a bone, the first step at replacing that with new bone is you've got to take away the old bone. So the bone resorbing or the bone eating osteoclasts come in and they take away the old bone. And so when you take away bone, you're creating some porosity in it. You're reducing the bone mass in that particular little site where you have that crack. And that's got to happen first before you can replace it with new bone. So these are sequential sort of activities. You've got to take away bone before you can add new bone at that same site. And so what happens is if you've got too much micro damage, then you've got this, it's called targeted remodeling, where the osteoclasts come in and they take away lots of little pockets of bone and it increases the porosity. And when you have increased porosity in a bone, it reduces the stiffness or the strength of it. And it's sort of akin to osteoporosis. Osteoporosis in elderly is porous bones, whereas these bone stress injury they're porous bones, but very localized to where you're mechanically loading. So you don't have osteoporosis, but you have very localized porosity. And that localized porosity then predisposes you to getting more damage as you continue to load.
Stu, you cite in the paper something I found fascinating around the timeframes for the osteoclast to be activated and resorb cortical bone. You cite it's about approximately 4 weeks, but the new bone formation takes up to 3 months and full mineralization of the bone can take 1 year. So that to me, how do the bones ever get it right and not always end up in a state of bone stress and pathology?
So it's this nice balance. You've got microcracks of all different ages. So while some are being resorbed actively now, some are finishing their mineralization. So you've got this constant turnover. And this happens throughout your whole life. But the 3 to 4 week sort of time period is clinically relevant and important. So if you've changed your training program or you've introduced excessive load for what your bone can take, the bone stress injuries don't occur tomorrow. So if you go out and run today, you get off the couch and you go and run 5K for the first time, you're not going to get a bone stress injury tomorrow. What's going to happen is it's going to be 3 to 4 weeks later that biggest change in your workload or the training sort of shows up as a bone stress injury. And that's important to remember clinically, that you may be able to change something this week and be fine next week, but it's the 3 weeks later that you've got to, 3 to 4 weeks later that you've got to keep an eye on. And that's just, sort of where some of that acute chronic workload sort of paradigm sort of comes from, Tim Gabbett and others, that, you've got to look at your acute load versus chronic. And it does take a number of weeks, often for particularly stress fractures, bone stress injuries to present.
The practical application is if you're an athlete that's developed a bone stress injury or a treating practitioner, it's not a matter of what the athlete has done 3, 4, 5, 7 days prior or 1 day prior. It's looking back 3 or 4 weeks to see if there is likely some workload error.
Exactly, and that's the key, is that you've got to go. Really, you've got to go back a number of weeks, and sometimes it could be a couple of months, because it might not be a pinpoint. This is where I change. It might be a gradual change that you've introduced a gradual overload, and it might not be one sort of week or one incident where you're like, oh yeah, this is where I increased my training by 50%. It might have been this gradual increase that you ramped up. So it could be 3 to 4 weeks. It could be 8 weeks where you have to go out. And the important part is that, particularly for athletes, is documentation. A lot of people are into documenting these days and recording metrics and so on. And that is so important with people who present with these bone stress injuries, is that you've got to be able to go back and not do it via recall, not try and ask the athlete, say, okay, what you do 8 weeks ago? If they've got the data and say, okay, in the last 8 weeks, this is how many miles or kilometers I've done. This is the intensity I've done. These are, the cross training and so on. If you've got that in front of you, you can really get down to the nuts and bolts and work out exactly sort of what's going on.
You mentioned the word there, Stu, intensity, which for me was a real takeaway from this paper, just how important, because I mean, so many runners, obviously, and athletes, and it's easy to get caught up in the metrics of volume or time on your feet for runners, but it's this intensity that's so important. The paper, yourself and your team cite that there's this inverse relationship between the magnitude of the bone loads or stresses and strains and the effect that has on the number of loading cycles before that bone develops fatigue or failure. Can you speak to that, Stu? Because I found that just so fascinating. I think many people may mistake that it's about the number of loading cycles, but you write that, no, think about the magnitude.
And the key here is the magnitude. The risk of a bone stress injury in terms of numbers of loading cycles. So you think about how many times someone hits the ground. It's predictable, basically to a one-to-one relationship. As your loading cycles go up, your risk goes up in the same proportion. Whereas when your magnitude goes up, it's actually more of a power relationship, or you can think of it exponential. As your magnitude of loading goes up, it's not a one-to-one risk ratio. Your risk goes up exponentially as your magnitude goes up. So you can tolerate increases in numbers of loading cycles pretty well. Bone's pretty well designed to be able to tolerate lots of loading cycles. But as that magnitude goes up, then your risk of bone stress injury increases more exponentially. So it is a combination of magnitude and load, but as you change your magnitude, that can push you over the hill more than increasing your actual, how many times you hit the ground.
And if I recall correctly, one of the statistics that you share, Stu, is somewhere around 10% increase in load magnitude of bone load can reduce or halve, I think, the fatigability or the threshold of fatigue in a bone from I think it might have been an animal study.
That is based on some modeling and some loading studies of bone, but it just goes back to the point that if you can reduce your magnitude of loading just a little bit, then you get a much larger decrease in your bone stress injury risk. Whereas if you decrease your mileage or your kilometers per week, you don't get the same sort of benefit as decreasing the magnitude of the loading. And that's what a lot of people don't realize is that, people will say, look, I'm doing, 100 kilometers, I'm doing 70 miles a week, and look at me, I'm doing this great mileage. But you've got to think about the intensity as well. If you're doing a lot of intensity work, then that can be often the thing that pushes you over the threshold to a bone stress injury or really any type of musculoskeletal injury.
The golden question and magical solution would be how to progress runners' workloads so that they don't develop bone stress injuries, noting that magnitude or the intensity of the runs are so key in determining that it's an algorithm, right? And your paper obviously gives some good guidelines, but it's still going to need to be a one-on-one individual approach.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's very personalized in terms of how you advise someone how they can exercise and how much they can do. And it's really working with that athlete. There's a number of aspects to it. And one is knowing what they've done in the past, knowing where they're coming from. And so do you have someone who's a novice who really hasn't done a lot in the past? Or if you've got someone who's, got some training background that you can go back to and work out what has that person been able to tolerate in the past. So you're trying to work out based on that individual, what can they tolerate? What sort of changes can they tolerate based on what they've been able to do in the past without getting injured? And so you're sort of getting this baseline of, okay, this is what we can sort of change by. The one thing, particularly for more novice runners who are maybe training for their first run, first half marathon or marathon, is making sure you give yourself enough time to build up that intensity and that workload. And the longer you give, then the safer you're going to be in terms of injury. So a lot of people don't make it to the start line of their first half marathon because they get, 8 weeks into a program and they break down. The longer you can give, the better it is. And you do want to increase the distance you're running progressively, but you've got to also think about the intensity as well and trying to find that balance between intensity and distance. You might have someone up to a certain mileage or kilometers, and that's what we try to do first is try to get someone up to a certain level of distance. Once they're up, because it's much safer to get the mileage than to get the intensity, what we've already talked about. So get them up to the desired mileage. once you're up at that sort of distance per week, then you can start introducing your intensity work. But before you do that, you drop the mileage down just a little bit, right? So you drop it down a bit. Now you're starting to introduce some more intensity because you're increasing workload. You build up the mileage again at the new intensity up to that base mileage. Then as you increase the intensity again, drop down the mileage a little bit. So it's this sort of to and fro between, getting a certain workload in terms of distance and a workload in terms of intensity.
And I think a fatal flaw that so many athletes, including myself, so many times over the years make is we get excited and carried away, and all of a sudden we're increasing the mileage and the intensity rather than pulling back on the mileage as we add intensity.
No, definitely. And that's what breaks down a lot of people and stops them from getting to start lines is increasing the intensity while they're also trying to build that mileage base. And so they're getting at this double-edged sword that, they're increasing their mileage, so how many times they're loading the bone, but they're also increasing how hard they're loading the bone. You're changing too many things. And the bone then just says, no, thanks. That's enough. And we haven't really talked about what do we mean by intensity. When I'm saying intensity, that's really ultimately comes down to the speed of running, how fast you're going, how hard you're going. And we know that as you increase your speed, you're increasing the load magnitudes on the bone or the magnitudes that the bone is seeing. You've really got to, you build up that base. You can have some intensity sessions in there, but you don't want every session to be an intensity session because you end up overloading the bone.
And if you look at the spread of intensity work, so, higher intensity work through a training cycle, Stu, listeners of the show are familiar with the work of Dr. Stephen Seiler, et cetera, around polarized type training for intensity control. It's always going to be individual, but any guidelines you'd share perhaps with the runner that's coming back off either one or a series of bone stress injuries with how much intensity they may end up having in a week or a training cycle?
That's a good question. Someone who's coming back or who, we know that the risk of a bone stress injury, the biggest predictor of a bone stress injury is a previous history of a bone stress injury. That's your number one risk factor. So if you've got an athlete who's had a stress fracture or bone stress injury in the past, then that raises the red flag already as to, okay, this person's already had a bone stress injury. There's a reason for it. And a lot of people will just put it down to, they overtrained. Often that's not the case. You've got to look at every component, from nutrition to sleep to caloric intake to in females, menstrual cycle, all those sides, the relative energy deficiency in sports side of things, the athlete triad. You've got to put it all together. But in terms of, increasing someone's intensity, you've really got to go back. This is where you've got to go back and look at what they've been able to tolerate in the past and working out sort of what level did they get up to in the past before they got injured? Was the workload the issue, or was it some of these other extrinsic factors or intrinsic factors in the athlete that brought on that bone stress injury? You might just have to go a little bit slower on that athlete in terms of increasing the intensity. You might just have to pull back just a little bit and give them extra time in the lead up to, particularly to a competition or a particular race, so that they don't get to 1-2 weeks out and bang, they get hit with another bone stress injury.
And that brings up a great conversation point, Stu, around the assumptions so often that it's just they've overtrained. It's just a training workload error, yet it sort of ignores the biological ability of the bone to resist load, which you write about in the paper, and I've heard you teach on this over the years. So that's bringing up things around the athlete's skeletal health. And one of the little subsections of this paper, which I thought was quite catchy, is this subheading or subsection, not all athletes have good skeletons. And the follow-on from that, the next subsection is distance running does not build good bones. So it's a big area, and I know you could speak for hours on this, but can you just touch on, Stu, some of the misconception about running and bone health and some of the underlying challenges that distance runners can have with their skeletal health?
It's true. Not all runners have good bones. We know a lot of bone health is genetic. There's also other components to bone health, whether it be history of mechanical loading, physical activity, and nutrition, vitamin D, calcium, and so on. But we know running is not a great bone building sport. We've shown this in in animal models principally that when you load a bone, when you load the skeleton, after about 100 loading cycles, so back-to-back loading cycles. So you think about someone running down the street, how long it takes them to land 100 times on their right leg. It's not very long. So after about 100 loading cycles, those bone cells become deaf in the sense that they see that stimulus, they respond in that first 100 cycles, and then they start to shut off. And they're like, well, okay, we've seen that stimulus. Show us something new. And so if you think about someone going out for a long run, and after 100 or so cycles, loading cycles, those bone cells are like, yeah, okay, we've seen enough. And they start to shut down and they turn off. And so you can see why distance running, where it's pretty unidirectional, you're not changing direction, you're not loading different parts of the bone, you're just loading the same parts over and over and over again, that once those bone cells shut off, they don't respond to the other 20,000 cycles the rest of that day in that running cycle or that running training that you've just gone on. The bone cells do become responsive again. So they shut off, but after about 4 to 6 hours, they become responsive again, and you can hit them again with another loading, and you can actually generate a better bone adaptation. And one of my colleagues here at Indiana University, Alex Roebling, showed this, that when you load a bone for 360 cycles and you break those 360 cycles over 4 bouts throughout the day, so you do 90 in the morning, 90 at lunchtime, 90 at dinner, 90 at bed, you actually get more bone adaptation than if you introduced all those 360 cycles all at once. So they're getting exactly the same stimulus in terms of numbers of cycles, in terms of magnitude of load, and so on. The only difference is you're breaking it up into different bouts. So running itself is not a great bone building activity. This is why we often encourage runners to incorporate some other sort of activity in their daily life or their daily activities or exercise to try and think about bone building. The best time to build bone is before puberty. When we present on this, when we tell people, basically after puberty, it's really hard to build your bone. What we're trying to encourage people to do now is that if you've got junior athletes, young athletes who are really good runners, they're elite at junior level, is they need to be able to take time off from running. They need to do other sports. They need to load the skeleton in multiple directions to build a bigger, more robust skeleton. Because once you hit puberty and just past puberty, your bones don't get much bigger in response to exercise. You really only get it before puberty. So we try to encourage distance runners, cross-country runners to really not specialize until they get to high school. And high school in the US is, 9th grade in other countries. Really not to specialize. They can run and they can be elite, good runners before that, but they need to have time off and do other sports to load their skeletons in multiple directions to develop a more robust skeleton as they age.
And the benefit of that, Stu, is that a more robust skeleton post-puberty is going to help them in terms of dealing with micro damage accumulation and offsetting the risk of bone stress injuries and more likely fulfilling their potential and enjoyment.
Exactly. And we see this in a lot of other sports where people specialize too early and they're playing sport 12 months of the year. It might be baseball or other sports. They're the best in the country, at a young age, but then they don't make it to the elite level because they break down. They haven't developed their other systems, whether it be balance, coordination, core stability, all these other sort of, multi-directional sort of loading, proprioception and so on. They end up getting injured over and over and again, and they don't make it to the elite level. And we've seen this in long distance runners too, particularly females who really national level, at a young age in their early teens. And they basically break down and they don't make it to the higher levels because all they've done is run and run and run and run, and their body just can't take it.
Yeah, it's and you see that then manifest in clinics as a practitioner where people come in with a series of bone stress injuries, and often that's the catalyst to go on and determine their bone health, if you like, and their bone density for one. And sadly, there's often some surprises. And as you mentioned, we've got to remember that so much of this is genetic, but then there's also these environmental factors that can determine the health of the bone. And I find it quite sad and challenging at the same time when you have an otherwise outwardly looking fit, healthy person who is maybe not as healthy as they thought, particularly at a skeletal level, maybe osteopenic or even osteoporotic at quite young ages.
No, exactly, and that's what we tried to get to in the paper is that prevention is starts at a young age, and it starts with educating coaches who are training really young athletes that they've got to be on the outlook, because once you get those athletes who have had multiple bone stress injuries and have got really poor bone health for their age, it's really hard to reverse that. The damage is pretty hard to reverse. And so if you can prevent that from happening from a young age in terms of education about not just running 12 months of the year, doing other sports, advice regarding diet and caloric intake, and trying to get away from a focus on the leanness. A lot of coaches still talk about, I need you to be lighter because lighter is more efficient. That only goes to a certain extent, because once you're too light, then it interferes with your hormonal side of things, which affects your bone side of things, and you can't run. So it's getting this balance between nutrition, being a healthy weight, and being efficient as a runner.
You share on a fantastic masterclass you did with Physio Network about bone stress injuries in the field that I've watched numerous times. The finding that 3 or 4 risk factors of relative energy deficiency in sport, which is fortunately more commonly becoming, more people are becoming aware of it in the field. But 3 or 4 risk factors, which can include greater than 12 hours participation per week, participation in a leanness sport such as running, menstrual irregularity, etc., BMI less than 21, that can increase the risk of bone stress injuries by 15 times.
Exactly, and that's we know what the risk factors are. So it's making sure that the people out there who are training these athletes sort of know them as well, and parents as well, because often it's too late when they come to see us. Often it's too late. It's when they have the bone stress injury, they come to see you in the clinic. It's like, okay, these signs have been there for the last 12, 24 months. And if we had picked up on them earlier, then we wouldn't be where we currently are with this particular athlete. So it's really trying to get into the prevention side of things and stop this from happening. Often, these bone stress injuries, they don't happen usually during routine sort of just training. They're usually in the build-up to a major competition, major race, and they take you out. You can't run on it. You cannot compete on a bone stress injury because, we've seen what happens when athletes do that. Their bone breaks. It snaps while they're running along. You really have to try and get them educated as early as possible.
And just as we record, we're several weeks out from the Olympic Games, Tokyo 2020, 2021, and I certainly always hold my breath for who's going to potentially break before they get to the start line, particularly in endurance sports. It's a dangerous time.
It is. It's this fine balance, and it happens every year. You're going to have, there's going to be athletes who don't make it to the start line because of a bone stress injury, and it's really that challenge. How much do you hold someone back for fear of a bone stress injury, or how much do you push them to get the benefits so that they can actually potentially win at the Olympic Games? And this is where everyone is in the same boat. It's like, how hard can we push? How much is too much? And that's been the question for the last forever.
And it's I guess just trying to mitigate those risk factors, those known risk factors, and you follow principles in progressing the workload. Stu, so much you just shared. It's so helpful. Just practically going back to the sensitivity of bone and the ability for bone to adapt, say in bone density post-puberty. So practically a good intervention, maybe 20 counter movement jumps or several times a day for a runner that's looking to try and augment bone health?
Yeah, no, definitely. We know that the thing that loads bone the most is not hitting the ground, it's the muscle contractions. So we're not looking at having someone land heavily. We're having them to try and push off as quick as possible. So you want to look at power activity, so plyometrics, jumping and those sorts of things. And you can land softly, that's fine. But what you want to do is try and push off as hard as you can and jump as high as you can, and then land pretty softly. So that it's the muscle that is the primary loader of the bone. You don't need to do a lot. Like we said, 100 back-to-back cycles. If you're doing jumping, you're not going to get up to 100 cycles unless you're doing skip rope or something like that. But yeah, doing some counter movement jumps, multi-directional sorts of things, playing a little bit of basketball in the driveway, or doing something, kicking the ball around with kids, soccer ball and things like that. When you start introducing these sorts of things, though, you have to remember that these activities are introducing bone load. So you've got to think about your running workload. If you are going to start introducing plyometrics and other things, you need to drop down your running workload a little bit first, because this is going to be superimposed on what you're doing running-wise. So drop your workload a little bit, start introducing plyometrics. It might be once a day. You might have a plyometric session once a week to start with, or you might start and then progress it to being more regular, but drop your workload or your mileage or whatever, kilometers, introduce the plyometric bone loading side of things. As you're tolerating that, then you increase your running workload back up again.
Just because you don't want to throw too much in at once and cause a training error. Exactly.
If you're progressing and this is not something you're going to do in the lead up to a major race. This is something you're going to do. Okay, you've just come off a major race. You're starting to build up again. Okay, I want to start introducing some plyometrics, some more strengthening stuff. And not only will it help your bone, we know the muscle strengthening and the power side of things also helps you running. So it's going to make you a better runner. But it's not something you're going to do 4 weeks out from a major race.
And Stu, it's going to be individual, of course. It's going to be determined by an athlete's history, if they've had a history of bone stress injuries, etc. But what sort of frequency might or could someone benefit from if they are looking to truly help their skeleton adapt? Is every other day a good guideline, or could it be daily?
It can be daily. I would not do it immediately before or after running, because you're just hitting those bone cells all together. So you want to do it, 4 to 6 hours after run. You might run in the morning, and then you want to do your plyometrics 4 hours later. Once those bone cells become responsive again, if you do it immediately after running, you're basically wasting your time because the bone cells are deaf and you're just loading your skeleton. So it's not working. So do it after a few hours, after you've finished loading the skeleton. But you can do it daily. It's just a matter of building up your tolerance to that and not say, okay, I'm currently doing 70 miles, 100K a week. I'm going to do plyometrics daily now. And you just throw that on top of your current mileage. You want to think about, okay, I'm going to do this 3 times this week. I'm going to drop my mileage a little bit. I'm going to do some plyometrics Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or whenever. Do it for 3 days a week, increase your mileage back up. And then if you think, okay, I want to start doing this daily, you're going to have to drop your mileage a little bit more again, and then start doing it daily, and then build your mileage up again.
So it's just keeping that overall workload consideration in there. Stu, you mentioned that the muscle forces, the contractions, I should say, load bone. Your paper cites the work of, I can never pronounce it, Matt Chivette. You might be able to help me, Stu.
Emily.
Emily's paper there, which really showcase that ground reaction forces aren't the prime loader of bones, if you like. I think I recall tibial bone loads internally being somewhere in the magnitude 6 to 14 times body weight that they referenced somewhere in that paper. How high do bone loads get, say, in the femur, the tibia? It's not just a multiple of the ground reaction. It's not a reflection of the ground reaction force, is it, alone?
No, it's not. And we have some data that we've submitted for publication that your ground reaction force and when your peak bone strains or bone loads occur, they don't coincide. And this is currently a debate in the field, is that bone stress injuries, are they due to the bone loading magnitude or is it the loading rate? They occur at different times. So the peak bone loading rate occurs when you hit the ground. That is sort of your ground reaction force sort of spike, that transient there. The peak bone strains occur later, halfway through the gait or running cycle, when your muscles are contracting and pushing off. So there is still debate, and we haven't resolved it as to, is it the loading magnitude or is it the loading rate that's most important? And I think, from my opinion, it's both. It could be either, and they probably both contribute. But ground reaction force doesn't necessarily indicate what's going on inside at that, at the bone level.
Stu, the takeaway from that is, if you're doing counter movement jumps, I've heard in the past, and things have evolved obviously in the field, but Professor Belinda Beck, who's here on the Gold Coast, Australia, who through the Lift More trial, etc., would have some stiff-legged land-ins. And then I heard your colleague on this paper, Dr. Rich Willie, share around the fact that, like you just shared, you want muscle contraction, so land-in softly is potentially more favourable. So is a mix good, or would you just advocate for soft lands with good explosive push-offs?
I think for the runners, so Belinda's work is fantastic. It's directed more towards the postmenopausal and women and the older population. For the athletes, that we try to focus more on the explosive side of things rather than the heavy landing side of things, mainly because that explosive side of things also helps their running. So it helps, even if you're a marathon runner, if you work on muscle power and muscle strength, it benefits your marathon running. So you don't have to do, 50 squats or 50 counteracted, jumps. We're talking about sort of maximum efforts and sets of 8 to 10 and whatever. And Rich and other, Chris Barton and those, Christian Barton and those guys have published on, working muscle in terms of strength as opposed to endurance to improve people's running.
You're listening to Professor Stuart Warden on this expert edition, episode 281, Preventing Bone Stress Injuries in Runners. Support for today's show comes from Precision Hydration's new fuel range. I spoke to Andy Blow from Precision Hydration back on episode 234. Hydration science was the topic, and that was an incredibly popular expert edition. Now, we know that Precision Hydration are synonymous with helping endurance athletes of all levels get on top of their hydration requirements for optimal performance. I've spoken in the past about Precision Hydration's free online sweat test, and if you're yet to do that, I encourage you to jump over to precisionhydration.com and get that test. And now the team at Precision Hydration are aiming to do for fueling what they've done for hydration by helping us, you, the endurance athlete, understand how much carbohydrate you need to perform at your best. Take their quick carb calculator to get a fueling recommendation, and then book for a free one-to-one video consult with the Precision Hydration team to refine your fueling strategy alongside your hydration strategy for your next event. Once you know your numbers, you can use the new Precision Fuel 30 gels and Precision Fuel 30 drink mix to ensure you hit your numbers. Each product contains 30 grams of carbohydrate per serving to make it easier for you to keep track of your intake and ensure you're getting enough fuel in to perform at your best during both training and racing. I've tried out the Precision Fuel 30 gels, and they are a great blend. Now, the team have generously offered up 15% off your first order of Precision Hydration electrolytes and the new Precision Fuel range by simply using the code TPPS at the checkout, precisionhydration.com. Support for today's show also comes from our upcoming live stream event featuring Rinny McGregor, Fueling for the Endurance Athlete. Tickets are $49 per person and are available now over at pogophysio.com.au/Rinny McGregor live stream. During the live stream, Rinny will share years of accrued knowledge across 4 key modules, all designed to have you leave the webinar equipped around your optimal fueling needs. Rinny featured on episode 258, an expert edition titled Fueling for Health and Performance. It was incredibly popular, so if you're yet to tune into episode 258, do so. You'll get a great insight into the mind of Rinny McGregor, and from there, be sure to jump online for the live stream event. It's set for 4th of September, 3 to 6 p.m. Brisbane, Australian time. However, if you are in an overseas time zone, like so many registrants for our prior live stream events, don't be concerned. we'll be making available to you a post-event recording and access. And of course, our Patreon supporters will be receiving free access to Rinnie McGregor's upcoming live stream event. For now, let's jump back with this week's expert edition guest, Professor Stu Warden, on all things preventing bone stress injury risk in runners.
Stu, one of the other real thought-provoking points that came up from this paper was about the fact that over time, so periodizing an athlete's season, there's a decreased sensitivity to a block of training. So the notion, which I think so many distance runners, practitioners, coaches might share, is have a bit of an off-season, but otherwise it's working consistently right through the year and preferably building. But in my mind, thinking through the things you report in this paper or write about in the paper, it seems like a recipe to the next bone stress injury, unless there's some sort of periodization of the year. You cite that having a period off of several weeks after X amount, I think it might have been every 12th week, an athlete might consider a deload sort of period. I find that so practical, and so I find it so logical, given what we know about bones behaviour, but practically challenging because few runners would want to take time out even to cross-train if they're not injured. So what are your sort of suggestions here, Stu? I found this fascinating. How does that even work?
From a bone standpoint, the periodization that came out of a study that was done here at IU, actually at the same time I was doing my Post Doctorate here. It was done by another Australian who came over to do her Post Doctorate. And what they found was that it was a rat study, and they loaded these rats for 15 weeks. Then they had one group of rats where they loaded them for 5 weeks, then had 5 weeks off, and then 5 weeks again. So you had one group, 15 weeks constant loading. One group had 5 weeks, 5-week rest, 5-week loading. So the group that had the rest period had 50% less loading. But when they took the bones out and analyzed them for strength and so on, those bones that had that rest period were stronger. They adapted more. So by doing a period of training, then giving the bone cells a chance to rest again and resensitize or reset, they became more responsive again when you introduce loading again. So that's where this periodization sort of for bone health came in from an overall standpoint, that you should be giving not just bone, but all your tissues some sort of off period, usually about 3 months, take a week off. Some people will take 1 day off a week, but we say after about 3 months, if you can take a week off, and we're not saying, hey, just go and sit on the couch. You don't have to, because a lot of athletes, as soon as they take 1 day off, they're like, oh, I feel deconditioned. I feel like I'm losing fitness just sitting here, trying to get them to cross train. As you said, it's hard for them to do it. If they can get on the bike, they can do high intensity interval training on the bike. They can do water running. They can do, a lot of people are using the pressure treadmills.
Anti-gravity treadmills?
Yeah, anti-gravity treadmills. And there's a number of different types out there now. Doing some sort of exercise. So you're still working your fitness and cardiopulmonary fitness, but you're giving the musculoskeletal system a break from that loading.
And for runners that have had a history of bone stress, that 12-week interval and then a week deload, the skeleton still cross-train cardiorespiratory-wise, cardiovascular-wise for fitness, should that 12 weeks, could that be potentially lesser, like a 6-week period, then have a week off? Or is the 12 weeks more practical or better for a reason?
And this is where you get down to the individual athlete side of things and working out, okay, let's look at your history. Let's look at your injury history. Let's look at what you've done in the past. When have these injuries occurred? So some athletes may be able to go 16 weeks and then take a break. Some athletes may have to do 8 weeks. And this is where you've really got to sit down with the individual athlete and work out and look at their history, their injury history, their training history, how they've changed their training in the past, and work out sort of, okay, when are these injuries appearing? And
try and best progress from there with that in mind. Is it enough to deload, say, by 50% of the normal training workload, or is it best to literally give the bone cells a true rest from the impact loading?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have an answer. This is all just opinion, that we're sort of talking. There's no evidence to say, hey, if you just drop by 50%, then, you're safe. I don't have an answer. I could, give you an answer, but it's really, there is no evidence for it.
Yeah, no, I understand. Clinically, in applying this, before this paper, I just intuitively felt that runners coming off the back of bone stress injury histories, trying to prevent the next one, should have some deload period. And I found it easy to sort of share the idea that when there's a bit of pushback that I potentially could stop running for a week. It's let's reduce it by 50%.
I hear. And that's the thing with the stress fracture and bone stress injury sort of status in terms of research is we really don't know anything. There's not a lot out there in terms of actual hard data guiding a lot of these principles. A lot of them are translated from other tissues. A lot of them are expert sort of opinion-based, which definitely counts. But strong sort of research evidence, we don't have a lot of great evidence to guide a lot of what we're sort of saying.
I mean, there's a lot more work to be done by the sounds of it, but it still makes sense intuitively. I think anyone that has had a history of bone stress injuries is open to the idea of manipulating their training workload versus just building week on, week out as long as they can until the next injury may present.
Yep. Yeah, and that, like I said, this is where you get down to looking at their history, and it might be that they might have gone through a 16, 18-week training block without a break, and they got a bone stress injury. Well, that's where you're like, okay, this next training block, let's stop you at 10 weeks. Let's take a week of doing cross-training or so on. You're not going to lose fitness. Come back in at that same level that you left at and then start building again. So you're not dropping back. You're just taking a week sort of respite, giving yourself a little bit of a musculoskeletal sort of recovery period and then kicking into gear again.
So a skeletal reset period. And it doesn't necessarily, I mean, as you say, there's not necessarily evidence to support this, but 1 week seems to make sense and it's probably cognitively acceptable by athletes to a degree.
Yep.
Or is a once a week, 1 day off a week over time going to be the equivalent, or it depends?
Yeah, it does. Does 1 day a week for 7 weeks, is that up to the same as 1 week off? I don't think it does, because taking 1 day off is not going to allow as much recovery as having 7 consecutive or even 5 consecutive days where you can have some recovery.
Because you that paper, and you referenced it, it's the difference in the routine loads and the new applied loads. So if there's a whole week off, that 1 week that follows that is a bigger change to the bones that are listening in. Is that right?
Yeah, and it's amazing when athletes take this 1 week off, they come back mentally so much stronger as well. Yeah. And, anyone who trains dragging on for, 16 weeks, that becomes pretty hard as you're building on week after week, and mentally it becomes fatiguing mentally. So taking that 1 week off to reset musculoskeletally, and working on cardiopulmonary, cardiorespiratory sort of things can actually reset not only the musculoskeletal side of things, but also the mental side of things. And they come back with more vigor and ready to go. Yeah,
brilliant. And then there's the off-season, Stu, which you've mentioned prepubescent wise, early specialization, which is greater than 8 or 9 months. Is that right? Of participation?
Yeah, if someone's basically running for more than 9 months of the year, and they're basically just running, that's all they're doing. They're not doing anything else. They're basically specialized, as opposed to someone who sports samples. And by sports sampling, we talk about people who play multiple sports throughout the year. Mm. There's pretty good evidence from a number of different retrospective sort of survey studies that people who played ball sports and these other types of sports before they came into military practice or military training, they had a much lower risk of bone stress injury than those who never played ball sports. We have a study going on right now that we're wrapping up recruitment, where we're recruiting elite or pre-elite, the collegiate level cross-country runners. And we're comparing the bone health of those who played basketball, soccer, and other sports when they were young versus those who just ran. And it's pretty interesting what we're finding in terms of differences in bone size and bone strength, that those who played soccer, basketball, and so on when younger have much more robust metatarsals. We're hoping to wrap that study up soon, but it sort of just goes towards that when you play these other sports when younger, you develop a more robust, stronger skeleton that hopefully can resist more loading when you're older.
Yeah, brilliant. And coming back from a period of rest throughout the year, I guess it's important to remember these findings and principles, which is progress the volume or the work before the intensity is added.
Yeah.
You can't...
Well, and even on that, coming back, you'll have athletes who are coming back from bone stress injury. And a lot of athletes, particularly in the past, were like, okay, it's 6-8 weeks post sort of injury. I don't have any pain. It's all good. I've been cleared to run. And they just go back to their normal running program. And bang, they get hit again, because during that 6 to 8 weeks, they've deconditioned. They've got to slowly build up again. They can't just go, okay, I'm healed, let's run again. You've got to build up slowly again. And particularly in someone who's had a history, you've got to build up even extra slowly. So there was a recent paper that came out in American Journal of Sports Medicine by Christy Popp, who looked at bone changes in the distal tibia of people who had a bone stress injury. And she found that after about 3 months on both legs was when the bone mass or bone health was the lowest. So if you think about that, if someone's recovering from bone stress injury, they're deconditioning, they're unloading, their bone mass is going down, they come back at 3 months, that's when their bone mass is at the lowest because they've deconditioned. And what she found was actually that repeat bone stress injuries more often occurred on the uninjured leg. And so we sort of looked at it and went, well, maybe during recovery, when someone has a bone stress injury, we need to be loading the unaffected leg. Start doing some hopping and so on. You might have to put a boot on the affected side just to protect it from incidental loading, but start doing some loading to maintain the bone health in that unaffected leg, so that it doesn't get a bone stress injury once you come back from your current injury.
You're listening to Professor Stu Warden from Indiana University sharing around preventing bone stress injuries in runners. Brought to you by Precision Hydration's Fuel Range. Now, if you missed last week's episode, it was another expert edition featuring Australian-based specialist psychiatrist Dr Asher Khan on all things ADHD, sport and exercise. And we've had a great amount of feedback about Dr Asher Khan's share-ins. There were so many learnings to be had, and I assume many listeners like myself personally took a whole lot out of Dr Asher Khan's share-ins. ADHD, it's so prevalent in athletes, up to 18% of the athletic population. Here's a little snippet from Dr. Asher Khan's share-ins from last week's episode.
So exercise is an essential component, ADD or not ADD. When it comes to ADD, that addictive part that comes in is actually perhaps sustained by a brain trying to salvage your quality of life, giving you adaptive survival skills, allowing you to stay and evolve, because it's the way we are tuned. So part of that addictive behavior is your self-survival, as it is mine to get up and eat or breathe, okay? And so it could be looked at as having an addictive quality.
Yes.
But then basically you're saying, I'm addicted to surviving, which is kind of,
a good thing. To enjoy the full learnings from episode 280 featuring Dr. Asher Khan, be sure to jump over to wherever it is that you enjoy your podcasts from. We're also easily found now on YouTube as well. Whilst there, peruse the archives dating all the way back to episode 1, featuring surf lifesaving Ironman champion Ali Day. For now, let's jump back with this week's featured guest, Professor Stu Warden, Professor of Physical Therapy and the Associate Dean for Research at the Indiana University's School of Health and Human Sciences on this expert edition, Preventing Bone Stress Injuries in Runners.
Before we get you to summarise some thoughts, to just briefly, the influence of running mechanics on bone workload, cueing cadence, increasing cadence, obviously increases the number of loading cycles, but can reduce some of those internal bone loads. But is there any tips you'd share around that? How important that is? I guess it's all relative to the individual that's in front of you.
Yes, a lot of people look at running mechanics and for bone stress injury, stress fractures, but also for all types of different injury. And, you can try and teach someone to run softer. You can try and increase their cadence. You can, all sorts of different sort of approaches. And the research is starting to come out on that. I saw, I think on Twitter the other day that telling someone to run softer doesn't actually decrease loads. So that may not be the way to go. But the one that looks like it has the most sort of steam is increasing someone's cadence. And it comes back to what we've talked about earlier, that bone can tolerate an increase in number of loading cycles, particularly if you decrease the magnitude of loading. And so by increasing someone's cadence, how many steps they take a minute, then they're landing softer, they're using potentially less muscle force loading of the bone. And yes, you're introducing more loading cycles, but Brent, who co-authors the paper that we're talking about, has modeled and shown that, an increase in cadence doesn't really increase the stress fracture risk at the tibia. It actually decreases it. This doesn't work, though, for metatarsal stress fractures. All right, so increasing cadence is not going to change your risk of a metatarsal bone stress injury. It's more directed towards tibia and femur side of things. But Brian Heiderscheit group just published a prospective study of college athletes, and they were looking at what are the risk factors for a bone stress injury in collegiate cross-country runners. And they found that basically cadence was the primary thing that predicted bone stress injury. And athletes who had the lowest cadence were at the highest risk of a stress fracture. You can flip that and say, okay, therefore, to prevent bone stress injuries, we need to increase someone's cadence. We're not going to do that in every athlete. We're not going to grab an elite athlete, an Olympian, and say, hey, let's increase your cadence just for the fun of it. We're talking about often it's the amateur athlete who's had maybe multiple bone stress injuries, where it's like, okay, let's look at your cadence. Let's look at how many steps you're taking a minute. Let's see if we can increase that by 5 to 7% and see what that does for them.
And I'm an example of that, Stu, coming off a sequelae of femoral shaft bone stress injuries in the last 5 or 6 years. Every run, I'm just trying to optimize my cadence to take advantage of any help I can get.
Yeah, no, definitely. We have enough biofeedback mechanisms now that you can do it. And it is pretty easy to increase someone's cadence, and they can do it. This is something that can be taught pretty easily and become to the routine. And I find myself doing this during runs as well. It's, when I'm struggling, it's when you're struggling that you start to overstride and your sort of cadence goes down. So towards the end of races, I'm often like, okay, I got to increase my cadence here. I'm starting to struggle. I'm starting to fatigue. Let's think about quick, short steps and, going that route.
Get it done. Stu, drawing to an end of our time, I'm going to ask you a challenging question. What are Professor Stuart Warden's top 3 tips for preventing bone stress injuries in runners? And we must get this paper out, read the paper, but summarising, top 3 tips.
Top 3 tips. Wow. The first one is to document your workload, document your training. Right? So have it on paper. Have it. There's so many programs and apps these days that you can document what you're doing, so you can track your workload over time. And don't just track distance. We've talked about this. There is no golden sort of distance that you need to go for. And the person who has the longest distance is not the best athlete. What you're thinking about is quality distance. So you don't want to run the longest. You want to have good quality training sessions. So really document what you've done in terms of intensity and distance. So don't just look at your distance. Really have some sort of measure of intensity, and it could be a self-reported measure. How hard you found that session. Was it the hardest session you've ever done? And document that as you go along. So that would be the first thing is documentation. The second one is to really look at those other factors. So look at nutrition, sleep, particularly females. Monitor your menstrual cycle. It's amazing how a lot of girls sort of just ignore it. And it's not until you ask them, it's like, when was your last menstrual cycle? And they're like, well, come to think of it, I don't really know. And it's like, well, how can you not know? So there's plenty of apps these days on every phone that you can document when your menstrual cycles were. And when they start going awry, when the timing between your menstrual cycles become much more irregular, then that can be a red flag that, hey, you're starting to overtrain, or there's something going on, whether it's insufficient calories or there's something happening. That can be the first sort of red flag that, okay, you're on the course towards a bone stress injury. So that's 2. And then number 3, I'm trying to think what would be number 3 definitely is increase your distance before you increase your intensity. right? So build up your base in terms of distance, your mileage, or think about what is that you want to get to. A lot of people have these, I want to get to 100 miles a week. I was like, well, why? Get to some sort of level, something that's feasible. Get up to that sort of level by running lots of easy miles, right? We're not talking about a lot of intensity work. Then once you've got your base, that mileage base at a certain level, then start adding your intensity. But as you add your intensity, drop your mileage a little bit, right? So mileage first, then intensity.
Great tips, Stu. Top 3 tips there were document training, 2, look at other factors such as menstrual cycle, fuel in, sleep, 3, increase distance before intensity. And Stu, off the topic of bones, just more generally speaking, every guest of the show answers 2 set questions. One is your top tip or top learning to help listeners perform at their physical best. So all your years of clinical experience as a clinical physiotherapist, also as a researcher, what would Professor Stu's top tip for listeners to perform at their physical best be?
Well, the top tip would be, from my own personal, standpoint of running. And, I took up running, probably 3 years ago. Once my kids were old enough, I could leave them home by themselves and they wouldn't, burn down the house. We decided, okay, we can start running. And the thing that really helped us with our running was joining a team, getting in a group. Running can be very individual and you can train as an individual. But if you're going out to do intensity work, it really helps to do it as a group. So, we have a group that we run with. We do intensity or quality workouts every Tuesday and Saturday. Sometimes it's on the track and there's like 30 of us all working, supporting each other and going as hard as we can for that. And it really holds you accountable. So, I think if you're out there and you're struggling as a runner and you sort of feel like you're not getting anywhere, then reach out, find a group, get a training partner. Through our group, I found a guy that happens to run pretty much the same pace as I do. So we sort of work together a lot. It really has helped.
That's a great practical suggestion, Stu. And finally, every guest of the show issues listeners with a physical challenge for the week. So what is Professor Stu's physical challenge going to be?
Physical challenge is you need to do 20 counter movement jumps 3 times this week. So 20 counter movement jumps 3 times at least this week. And
if you do take that physical challenge on, you can reach out and let Stu know. You're active on Twitter. You're saved as one of my notifications. Whenever you tweet, I see it. It's at Stuart J. Warden.
That's correct. That's me. I'm not on Twitter a lot. I get on there. It's a lot of information. And so it's too much information sometimes. So I get on when I can, but definitely reach out and I'll try and respond as quickly as I can.
And Stu, you're prolific in the outputting of scientific papers there. If people want to look for your body of work, then I guess Google Scholar or ResearchGate, or they can easily find you over on Indiana University. Yeah,
no, definitely. And if there's papers that people, a lot of papers are behind paywalls and you have to pay for them and things like that. If you go through ResearchGate and send me a message through ResearchGate, you find the paper you want, you can request a full text copy. I can quickly send you the copy of that paper through those sorts of avenues.
Very generous, Stu. And on behalf of myself, the listeners, thank you for your contribution to the show and your time today.
No problem. Thanks for having me. It's been great.
So there you have it, another episode of the Physical Performance Show, and I trust and I know you enjoyed Professor Stuart Warden's sharings. If you did, then please reach out to Stu. You'll find Stu over on Twitter. As you heard Stu say, he's not on there a lot, but when he is on there, he's got some great stuff to share. You'll find Stu at Stuart J. Warden on Twitter. Now, we'll tag everything up in the show notes, including links to Stuart's ResearchGate profile and some of his more recent publications, including today's paper of discussion, Preventing Bone Stress Injuries in Runners with Optimal Workload. Huge thanks again to today's show sponsor, Precision Hydration, for their support of the show. Don't forget, you can receive 15% off your first order of Precision Hydration electrolytes and now their all-new precision hydration fuel range by using the code TPPS over at checkout, precisionhydration.com. A massive thanks to the patrons of the show. Big shout out to our recent patrons, David Proceda on the Gold Coast. David is an avid endurance athlete. You can find David over on Strava. And also patron Kathleen Dorsey. Thank you for your support, Kathleen and David. It really does help with the production of the show. If you'd like to pledge your support, you can do so from just $5 per month by jumping over to Patreon, searching for the Physical Performance Show. And as a small way of saying thank you, we'll ensure you get complimentary access to all upcoming live stream events in featuring Rinny McGregor's upcoming Fueling for the Endurance Athlete live stream, and also complimentary access to our back catalogue featuring Dr. Stephen Seiler and also Dr. Shona Halson from 2020. Finally, if you are an endurance athlete concerned with bone, tendon or joint related injuries, Pogo Physio's online telehealth consultations with myself or any of the team can serve as a great vehicle to help get you back to your physical best following injury. Appointments are available over at pogophysio.com.au/telehealth. And here's a great little success story from Tasmanian-based recreational competitive triathlete Sarah, who herself overcame a persistent bone stress injury concern.
Hey, I'm Sarah. I'm a competitive age group triathlete from Australia, and telehealth 100% works. I did telehealth with Brad for chronic sesamoiditis, and I didn't need any hands-on treatment. I had exercise prescription and load management with my training. And this, along with Brad's expertise and genuine care, got me across my Pogo finish line.
A massive thanks, as always, to the great folk who make this show possible each and every week. Daryl Misson, our audio engineer, Susan Wilkin on all things show administration, Matthew Olding on all things show graphic design. Now, coming up with future editions of the Physical Performance Show, we have some real treats coming your way. We caught up recently with Australian cycling legend Simon Gerrans, who at the time of recording was in quarantine in Brisbane, Australia, having returned from commentating the Tour de France. And Simon shares around his highs, lows and learnings. We'll be catching up with some of our former featured performers regarding their Tokyo 2020 Olympic experiences, including Olympic triathlon champion Christian Blumenfeld. And of course, we continue with the learnings with some fantastic upcoming expert editions. So until then, keep pursuing your physical best performance. I'm Brad Beer, and this has been the Physical Performance Show.